Thank you. Yeah, go to the next one. So what we're going to do now, with Dr. Bhembe in particular, I'm going to be framing out this particular example in a historical and legal context, and then she's going to address it, and you know, we're going to address some questions around this. So when we're looking at the pathologizing of Black people in a way that benefits white society, white individuals, white institutions, I think one of the places to start is what's called meritorious manumission, which I'm going to talk about briefly. Now, I want to break down the definition. So what is meritorious? It basically means deserving reward or praise, laudable, commendable. Manumission, which is also called enfranchisement, was the act of an enslaver deciding to release a person or people that enslaver owned. And it could be done through a living deed, a last will and testament, but it could also be done by the issuance of a certificate. But it was based on the benefits of that enslaved person, the benefits they gave. So here are three areas under which freedom could be granted to an enslaved African person. They saved the life of their white colonial enslaver or another white person or his property. They invented something from which a white enslaver could make a profit, or they snitched on a fellow enslaved African person who was planning a rebellion or planning to run away. Now, I don't know if any of you, I mean, basically, manumission was important to whites in the context that it ensured, or tried to ensure in theory, the obedience of an enslaved person, and that they would reward that obedience with manumission eventually, or the promise of it. I don't know if any of you saw Django Unchained, the film. The so-called house slave Stephen, who was played by Samuel L. Jackson, in that movie, you see that he's completely bought into racist ideology that justified slavery in the South. He was an elder in terms of his role as an enslaved person. He had this kind of twisted relationship with his enslaver, Calvin Candy. And that relationship made him, Stephen, that so-called house slave, gave him the idea that he was superior to the other enslaved people on this massive plantation. And when you see his behavior, although he's not being offered manumission, I'm bringing him up because it shows the way white society and white slave society tried to disintegrate or destroy the bonds among African people who were enslaved and US-born descendants of African slaves. And so he was seen as someone who was a snitch. When you watch that movie, he completely is supportive of and has adoration even for Calvin Candy and Calvin Candy's white friends. So I just thought that was an interesting character that gives an example of that. And the final thing I want to say is really, in theory, the possibility of manumission was meant to placate otherwise resistant people of African descent who were enslaved. And as many of you know, if you've read history, there were many, many massive revolts. And in fact, it was the greatest fear of enslavers. The Jamaican sociologist Orlando Patterson, who was at Harvard, he wrote a book. And in that book, he looked at this theory called gift exchange to explain manumission. And he described it as a gift given by slaveholders to slaves in exchange for their loyalty and their faithful service. And this is a quote from his book called Slavery and Social Death. The practical purpose, Patterson explained, was, quote, to get an utterly degraded and socially dead person to serve faithfully and productively. And he coined the phrase social death. It refers to the condition of people who are not accepted as fully human in the society they're in. And in fact, he coined that in the 80s, and then it went on to be used to describe as socially dead. Roma people, known as gypsies, but Roma people, Jews, and others during Nazi Germany who were being obliterated at the time. So that's what that term refers to. The last thing I want to say, and then I'll hand it over to Dr. Bhembe for her comments, is that basically enslaved people in countries like Cuba and Brazil actually used manumission laws in the courts to gain their freedom. But the US had a very, very sort of strong legal culture against and aggressively opposed to manumission, a release of enslaved people. But in the US, there was the option, and some used it, basically to file freedom suits that were related to the idea of manumission under very narrow circumstances. For example, if you could prove that your mother had been a free woman. There were states that allowed and then banned manumission, Louisiana, Mississippi, and those interestingly were in the late 1800s, close to the end. So there must have been a sense of sort of panic among white enslavers in white society. And basically, I think now, given that legal and historical context, Dr. Bhembe, I don't know if you want to address the psychiatric portion. And I just had a couple of questions that perhaps can help frame this. And of course, please go ahead and, oh, sorry, before we do that, just go to the next slide, Frank. We just wanted to show you here very quickly what a manumission certificate looks like. This was in Santo Domingo, but basically it confirms a manumission, in this case, of an enslaver of his enslaved woman named Carmen. Next slide, please. And this is basically a graphic or a graphic of a man who I guess one might call an Uncle Tom sitting at his desk. He has his white wife in the photo and his children. Projects to empower Blacks are thrown in the bin. And if you look in the back, this is kind of a modern version of Stephen from Django, I guess, in many ways. So we just wanted to put a more modern context to that. I think there we can leave it there for now. Dr. Bhembe, you had mentioned that it seems improbable that a group of people might succumb to this level of control under this policy or this legal framework. And I was wondering if you could discuss how that happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordana, for that background, and Pharaoh for your introduction historically, and for the Racial Justice Collaborative for the invitation to join the conversation here today. I have to tell you, this is one of the most exciting places I can be on a Saturday morning or Saturday afternoon, because this is important work, and I think the psychological lens to it often gets overlooked, and I think it is actually central to potentially why we need to have conversations around reparations, include psychological impact, because that is embedded in our unconscious. And so for meritorious manumission, one of the things that happens during this process is this thing, we all know it, we know the name of it, it's called conditioning. And you think of, when you think of conditioning, you think of Pavlov and his dog, and the idea that he trained the dog to salivate on cue. So he would give him a piece of meat, or at least present a piece of meat in front of the dog, and then the dog would salivate, and then he'd associate that piece of meat with a bell. And then eventually he removed the piece of meat and then would just bring the bell, and the dog would salivate. But that kind of conditioning became such a powerful tool that actually it became something that whiteness decided it was going to employ to minimize the economic and social disruption of enslavement and the wealth of enslavement that they were benefiting from. And what they then did is they created policies like the meritorious manumission to incorporate conditioning into policy, into legal legislative mandates. So what ends up happening is that you get a process that actually then begins conditioning individuals, just as you might with Pavlov and his dog. So behavioralists believe that conditioning is just an idea of observable behaviors, a little bit separate from what we might understand as mental processes, which is that internal thing. The conditioning is things that we see outwardly. And a condition can occur for any number of reasons. It's usually related to something that we need as a primary need, a primary life source. And then there's a secondary conditioning, which is sort of associated to the primary life source to kind of benefit and increase it. But one of the things that we don't need to condition around is self-preservation. Jordana talked a little bit about self-preservation in her introduction, but we don't need to be conditioned to self-preserve. So that's a primary conditioning. It's something that comes automatic. It's reflexive for us. If you then tie that reflexive conditioning, that reflexive instinct of self-preservation to something else, like you would a bell for a dog who salivates around meat, like you would to a legal policy that might say your freedom, you can gain your freedom related to this, your acquiescence or your performance relative to your employment or employment. Wasn't that a Freudian slip? Your enslavement, then you might gain your freedom and thereby sort of preserve your life. So you could see why individuals might very well begin to connect this idea of these are these 4 things that I need to do, or 4 things. This is not snitch, tell on others who not snitch, create something that would make you rich, save my enslaver, make him proud or protect him or put him primary before anything that I might do, would begin to be the primary thing that drives your self-preservation, because somehow that gets tied to your freedom, which also is your preservation. So conditioning starts to play its hand in our American policy, and it is unseemingly co-opted potentially to keep enslavers blinded to the fact that they are actually surrendering their freedom, surrendering their life to a conditioned process. And there are those, however, who didn't surrender their life. They didn't surrender their consciousness because they were self-aware. And it takes a self-awareness to be able to resist. And there are plenty of examples of individuals who continued, despite the conditioning, despite the structures, to encourage sort of the connection between self-preservation and enslavement, to fight against that. Nat Turner, for one, being a prominent figure. But there are many others, Harriet Tubman, for one. I mean, I'm just naming names that you would potentially know, but these are individuals who would strike against the norm of conditioning. And that meritorious manumission is not something just that occurred in 1710. It exists today. If you had to think about it, it has been used as tools throughout history. And an example, just so we can sort of dispel any arguments that this actually can occur, and it does occur. There is documentation that North Koreans, POWs, prisoners of war, were held captive under the same psychological warfare as the meritorious manumission. They were separated from each other. They were told potentially to not aggregate with each other, to not promote each other's advantage, to promote the advantage of the Korean captor. These are white POWs, and potentially to see their captors as superior, as supreme, as much more important. And over the course of time that the POWs were captive, 7,000 of them, only 2,000 survived. And of those 2,000, without gates, without fences, and without guards, did not run away. Most of them who actually remained alive to tell the story would become befrienders of their captors, much like you can imagine the Django Unchained Samuel L. Jackson character. befriending the captor, looking at him as if he is a primary sort of a priority and preferential. So these things still exist. Snitching still exists. The idea that potentially you can't tell on us, you shouldn't tell on us, that protective capacity that the Black community has held has been a way of restoring our sense of independence from conditioning that is attempted to corral us into enslavement despite our own self-preservation.
Perfect. So I was going to ask you about the effects of the conditioning today, and you mentioned a few of them, including this idea we hear about it all the time with the police trying to do something and no one snitching, no one wants to talk and tell. So anyway.
Well, then there are others, right, Jordana? Yeah. There is the dissuaders of the critical race theory, or there's the voting rights detractors, or those who stand against affirmative action. I'm talking about Blacks, that is, stand against the actions that would destroy the advantage of whiteness in this country. They stand with it.
Yes.
Those are examples of how this psychological warfare, this psychological weapon continues to play itself out generation after generation. And the reason it does is because you teach you what you know. My grandmother, who was a child in the time of enslavement, would teach her mom how to protect herself in a white violence environment. That my mom then would teach me how to protect myself in a white violent environment, because that is sort of perpetuated in the way we groom and the way we sort of nurture our generation, the generations of children to follow us. So it's not unlikely then that these things persist. And if this, in just one other thing, if the environment continues to be hostile, continues to be abrasive, continues to be unsafe, then it makes also more sense that these things would persist in trying to protect against the conditioning that exists out there.
Correct. Okay, let's go on to the next, which is the discussion of these psychiatrists and these diagnoses. Frank, could you go to the next? I'm going to let Dr. Bhembe take this over, and then we'll engage in a little dialogue. So go ahead, please.
Yeah, so this slide is just to sort of frame our discussion around some of the ways in which psychiatry has played its hand relative to enforcing and perpetuating white supremacist notions and racism in this country. So the father of psychiatry, at least the father of American psychiatry, there was many sort of proponents of psychiatric care in Europe. And so that a lot of the American psychiatrists would go to Europe to study. But Benjamin Rush, one who really was trained by one of our Ivy League schools, the University of Penn, founded the American model of psychiatry. And in founding that, even though he was a proponent or abolitionist proponent, he founded it under the notion that, as Jordana actually mentioned a little earlier, that Blacks were inferior. And that in doing so, what he did is he proposed and promoted this notion that Blacks needed to be segregated from whites, because the illness or the inferiority that was inherent for Blackness or for Black individuals was contagious. And so whites needed to be separated from Blacks in order to assure that they didn't get this inferiority contingency. It's unfortunate to think that the author or the founder of the discipline of mental health care, which is the thing that I think is often overlooked for the Black and enslaved descendants and the Black enslaved individuals, because imagine, not only were you being physically tortured and you were being sort of culturally tortured, there were psychological weapons coming at you. Then you got these proponents of psychiatric care and psychiatric healing who are defaming and dehumanizing your existence further. It doesn't bode well for for what the legacy of psychiatry is going to bring. And sure enough, it did. It bears fruit, because then following Benjamin Rush, there were many others who came after him, but one noted was a psychologist, surgeon, Samuel Cartwright. And he published in an article, so he practiced in Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi, and he published in a small journal in that area these diagnoses that defined disorders for Black American or enslaved individuals, that explained why there were some problematic behaviors for them. One problematic behavior was that they wanted to run away from the plantation. They wanted to run away from their enslaver. So he coined this term called drapetomania. And in doing so, what he did is he encapsulated the existence of Blackness and the Black enslaved existence into a pathological context.
Dr. Bhembe, I'm sorry, can we move, we'll move on to the next slide since you're discussing drapetomania, is that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Frank, could you go to the next slide and then actually the next slide? Thank you. Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Bhembe.
Yeah, sure. So, so what Samuel Cartwright then starts to launch into is an academic conversation with his small community about this neuroses, or this pathology, which is in psychiatric terms some disease, a mental health disease, that causes these Black enslaved to run away. And it's interestingly curious how he could come to this understanding in that small area, and then how it became such a dispersed and disseminated idea. Well, what ends up happening is that he was very good friends with, he was actually in the military, and in the military, he befriended other psychiatric or medical providers, and there was another medical provider in Virginia as he was engulfed in his military duties, and he shared his information with them. And this person actually wrote another journal that was much more broadly disseminated. And as a result of that conversation, this article that Samuel Cartwright wrote for just 3 colonies in the South became something that was disseminated widely, even into Union territory and into the North, so that it no longer held just that. That's how it became an incorporated entity in the psychiatric history of our nation. It was embraced, it was encouraged, and it was adopted as a psychiatric diagnosis. And this psychiatric diagnosis held ground until the early 1900s. There were still individuals in 1920 being diagnosed with drapetomania, this idea that they're running away, and it was, and as Jordana said, actually, we could probably reference to that today, because there are those who, if you run away from the police, somehow that is being deemed as pathologic or criminal in some respects, and you need to be shot down. So the drapetomania, if you treat it, if you were treated kindly, well fed and clothed, why would you need to run away? If you raise your hands to level with the master or overseer, you should be punished because we're giving you such good treatment. What would be the need for you to go elsewhere? Next slide, please. And the next slide is just a depiction of what drapetomania essentially sort of suggests, that these individuals were really acting out of insanity to want to run away.
I have a couple of questions, Dr. Bhembe, if I may.
Sure.
Were there any recorded mental illnesses related to white people, or particularly even to white women, that you know of that you might compare or not?
There were. So the general idea of psychiatry at the time, or mental illness at the time, was dementia praecox, which suggested that there was mental illness that occurred early. Dementia was early, and praecox was early, and dementia was mental or brain illness. And it was so that psychosis, this idea of being out of self, being out of your mind, what did occur with white people, what was distinct about, and to be honest with you, there was sort of foul and cruel treatment of those individuals with mental illnesses, even amongst the white community. They would bore holes in the floor of their homes because there were no institutions, or if there were institutions and there weren't enough room to sort of embody or house them all, they would bore holes in the floor of their homes, and the individual would be planted into this 5 feet deep up to their chest. And then head would be covered with a crib, and they would be fed, they would be contained, and they would sleep in this hole. And actually, as you can imagine, they would end up dying in this hole. So there was a way in which the mentally ill were treated, inhumanely in general. But what was distinct about Blacks and whites, and certainly about women during this period, was that whites were deemed to have a brain disorder, that there was some luxury given to them, that this was actually out of their control. But for Blacks, it was deemed as if this was some character disorder, that this psychotic drapetomania was not just because they had a brain disorder, it was actually that this was an act of their will, and their will was getting away with them. They were getting beyond themselves. So a strong woman, a strong white man with a complaint, is what they would call it back in the day, would have the benefit of the the minds of those individuals in the day who were thinking around mental health care and mental illnesses. But Black individuals did not. They were left to be chained, whipped, tortured as a result.
Okay, let's go to the next one, and then I have another question around this. Could we do the next slide, Frank?
So the other diagnosis that Samuel Cartwright devised was called dysesthesia Ethiopia. And this disorder was really related to the idea of not wanting to work hard. And it came as emancipation began to roll out. And so individuals who had some freedom of their own, who were able to potentially navigate, didn't want to work so hard. Sharecroppers didn't want to work as hard as they had during the enslaved period. And so Samuel Cartwright then coined the term dysesthesia Ethiopia to suggest that there was something pathologic about that as well. But the truth is that the diagnoses would have been relegated, these diagnoses would have been relegated to obscurity if there wasn't some social or economic benefit that merited a medical framework to endorse them. So dysesthesia being something that potentially could benefit long-term enslavers or plantation owners, Jim Crow overseers, was now legitimized because it became medically coined, and it was given a distinction in the medical framework, such that now there was ways to potentially endorse it and perpetuate it, and through those means. So dysesthesia is, like it says here, found exclusively among Blacks, called rascality by overseers, easily curable if treated on sound physiological principles. And sensitivity to the skin was one symptom of the disease. So the skin should be stimulated. And what that really means is that they would be whipped. The best means to stimulate the skin is first to have the patient well washed with warm water and deep soap, then to anoint it all over in oil and slap the oil with a broad leather strap, then put the patient to some hard kind of work in the sunshine. So let's put them back to work. Let's whip them, and that will cure their disease. The slave will then be grateful and thankful to the white man whose compulsory power has restored his sensation and dispelled the mist that clouded his intellect. Could you imagine?
So we go back to the gaslighting, which is just this whole thing they've created to discuss, really, like you said, whipping. It also reminds me of this insensitivity of the skin, and some of you may have read this, that to this very day, there is still this idea, and it's in practical and even in books, that people of African descent have a higher pain tolerance. And they literally, even in the past few years, physicians and medical staff in certain hospital settings have had to they've had signs they've had to put up to remind them to give Black patients painkiller.
Yes.
And that's happening pretty much today.
Yes.
But so I have a question bringing these two examples of diagnoses. What ultimately was the purpose of having these diagnoses in the way that you've described them, which is very different from finding mental illness in white people at the time?
Well, the simple answer is that it's been a long tool to advance the pursuit of the idea of royalty, kingship, or this delusion of superiority for white people. If you look at the context of whiteness and the construction of whiteness in the American society, and Pharaoh referenced this a bit earlier, that there is some incentive around the cycle, and two, Black enslaved individuals were not the only ones subject to psychological impact. Whiteness was embedded deeply in the delusions that connect to the psychological impact around this construction. And so very strongly, this idea that they were superior, and even Samuel Cartwright and Benjamin Rush, those individuals who might have distinction in the culture already, did not fall immune to the idea of professing their superiority.
Okay.
And I think the next slide actually shows.
Go ahead.
The next slide actually shows an image of an individual who had received treatment for dysesthesia Ethiopia, whipping the devil out of him. And this was taken, if you would allow me, this was taken by two individuals right around emancipation and the Civil War, and they were taken by the Union troops, two members of the Union troops, or a member of the Union troop and his assistant, because this man, Peter, some call him Gordon or Peter. It's unclear which of those is his real name, but he ran away from his plantation where he was enslaved. And when he ran to the Union troops, or to the Union camps, and when he got there, they were amazed. There was actually another image of him circulating of when he first got there, clothed in tattered clothing, matted hair, obviously looking emaciated. They could not believe that this man would make it that far, but they also took a picture to argue the case that slavery was not just because of economic advantage. It was to perpetuate racism and dehumanization of Black people. And so there were the proponents who pushed against the idea that the medical establishment was trying to propel, but this evidence it was already done for Peter or Gordon, whichever name he's going to be called.
Great, thank you. We're going to move now into the 60s era. Next slide, please, and Dr. Bhembe, take it away.
Yes. So, we get Plessy versus Ferguson, we get Brown versus Board of Education, we get advancement in what appears to be American policy. But the psychiatric establishment, then as it does now, lags behind potentially the movement of the consciousness of man. It's very funny. You would think that psychiatry should lead the way because we are the proponents of those individuals who say we look inward. However, there is something to be said when you look inward and don't find yourself. So during the civil rights era, what became apparent when there were lots of voices, Martin Luther King being one, Malcolm X being another, voices rallying individuals to really speak outwardly about the injustices being done to them, the inhumanity they had to live in, the oppressive nature of their lives. And they galvanized such an energy amongst the people that the codification of control around that needed to happen. There was some fear from white from the white establishment that these Black individuals were rising up and were potentially becoming a threat to the structure of white supremacy, the structure of racial domination that existed in America. And so they used the medical establishment to perpetuate an instrument to contain that. The way they did that is they began to define this idea that violence and hostility towards whiteness was dysfunctional. And in that dysfunction, they defined another diagnosis, and they called it protest psychosis. So protest psychosis was a way in which they said, you know, these men become out of their mind, psychotic, because they're in this protest. They pretend to somehow have an anti-whiteness. And so they coined the term protest psychosis and incorporated it into the diagnosis of schizophrenia. So to your left on this slide are the symptoms that were prior symptomatology or characteristics of schizophrenia prior to the fear around civil rights and the fear around the eruption of a voice of black and others against the oppressive nature of the country, the impoverished psyche, shallow affect, which means that it just couldn't really show much in the way of expression, incoherent behaviors, hallucinations, confusion, catatonia, which is stiffness and inability to move, paranoia, which is extreme fear and anxiety, and then confused speech. They then connected, this is the discipline of psychiatry, connected the idea of protest and anti-white delusion into the diagnosis of schizophrenia and called it protest psychosis. So it became a distinction of schizophrenia. And next slide, please. Began to promote it as such, a condition which views Black male participant in activities such as civil rights movement as a contributing factor for aggressive, volatile schizophrenic symptoms in the Black community. Protest psychosis has long been contested for its racist and anti-accusatory overtones. The damage done by its assertions is evidenced in society today. Once considered a non-threatening disease that primarily targeted white middle-class female population, Jonathan Metzl, who is the author of this diagnosis, provides us historical exploration of the means by which schizophrenia became associated with the perceived hostility, rebellion, mistrust, and violence of Black men during the civil rights movement. And so John Wetzel actually wrote a book in 2010. He wasn't, I don't know, I think the idea of protest psychosis came about during the era of the civil rights and was promoted by many psychiatrists back then. But this young man in 2010 wrote a book called How Blacks Became Schizophrenic, Protest Psychosis, describing this. What he really goes into saying, and if you will, I'm sorry if I'm taking up too much time, but
no, go ahead.
What he describes is this idea that schizophrenia became a notion that needed to be coined and needed to be described because of the overwhelming swell of discontent around Black men primarily, and the violent nature in which that was embodied. Well, what he then goes on to say, Jonathan Metzl, in his book, Protest Psychosis, that, and Blacks adopted it as well. They began to adopt this idea of being schizophrenics, but what he doesn't explain is that just like the N-word, where Blacks adopted the N-word and began to use it as a term of endearment, Blacks took on the idea of, if I'm schizophrenic because I'm resisting the protest, resisting the unfair treatment, and resisting against the oppressor, I'm schizophrenic. Let me be schizophrenic. Essentially embracing the idea of self-preservation is not pathological. And like Jordana mentioned earlier, Black individuals at this point became the sort of pioneers of the idea of cultural paranoia. They were able to see the distinction between the context of your cultural environment driving mistrust and despair, and the mental health issue connected to biological processes that was paranoia related to psychotic or schizophrenia. So our young men, our Black bodies, our Black community very well, very advanced in their psychological understanding, at least not deluded in the throes of the dysfunction of whiteness, could see that this was not a pathology, that the pathology was actually in whiteness, not in them.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to point out that in going back to Pharaoh's presentation, when he talks about this concept of white rage, which was from the book of Dr. Carol Anderson, there's always been a pushback. And so when you look at, but you go back to the earlier part of what Dr. Bhembe was saying about looking at psychoses, or these diagnoses around wanting to run away from something when it's based in self-preservation. We see it replicated here again, I think, in protest, and seeing some type of psychosis in that. Dr. Bhembe, the question I have is, were there, like, what pushback was there to this diagnosis, either within the larger white community, and Black community and Black professionals?
There was some pushback because this became law. Next slide. Actually, let me advance. I'm prepared for you, Jordana.
That's okay. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No. So this is an image of an ad that was circulating in the American archives or psychiatric journals, advancing the psychotropic medication Haldol. So Thorazine is the sort of pioneer in the way of psychiatric antipsychotic medication. Haldol came very shortly thereafter, but it became the medication that was being promoted as the protest psychosis treatment. It could treat, as it says here, belligerent and assaultive individuals to become cooperative and often and compliant. Now imagine, so what you're really saying is the way to keep Black people quiet, the way to contain them, is to give them this antipsychotic medication, Haldol, so that there will no longer be any violent and hostile outbursts towards white people. And so there was these kinds of campaigns stirred a protest, not just in the rappers who started to coin the term schizophrenic as a way of resistance, but other psychiatrists, even there were some Jewish psychiatrists who actually started to rally against the notion of the sort of characterization of individuals related to their protest. And then there were a number of Black psychiatrists who at the time began to acknowledge and be verbal about this resistance of a psychiatric diagnosis being tied to pushing back against oppression. Alvin Toussaint, who maybe some of you have heard of, he is what you may know of him is that he was Bill Cosby's psychiatrist. He and a group of other Black psychiatrists started to push back against this notion to the American Psychiatric Association, and they got nowhere. They then went to ask, well, what about the idea of the white people? Why don't we just say that the extreme bigotry is a disorder? Like, why don't we talk about the fact that this homicidal violence that white people are infringing upon Black people, and the extreme prejudice that existed, that's a dysfunction. Unfortunately, that didn't get very far. They wanted to, and which makes total sense, call it a delusional disorder. And I might just argue that might still be the case even today, saying that it was a projected unacceptable behavior or sense of self that you are putting off on others, or an acceptable sense of who you are as a white person, pushing that off on Black people, and then trying to destroy the Black person to get rid of that projected thing. That was not accepted, but there were many protesters, there were sort of significant protesters, particularly in the community of psychiatry. And I will say this also, that sort of going back to the psychological frame around this, the idea of what it means to be embedded in dysfunction. So when you're talking about sort of now a medical establishment pushing and promoting dysfunction through its framing and through its sort of definition and its institutional training, you get promotion of bad behavior, you get promotion and propagation of pathology. In psychiatry, it's much like if you look at white America and the way that white America has behaved relative to their racist oppressive legacy, it's as if it's an inpatient psychiatric unit, to be honest with you. Because what you see are people displaying behaviors that are potentially not so uncivilized, but just culturally concordant, delusional, anxious, agitated, and disorienting, yet projecting that onto other people and saying that there's no problem. Why are we pretending as if we are a psychiatric unit, but not going to treat the patient? We're just going to treat everybody else but the patient.
Yeah. Dr. Bhembe, I don't know if this is correct, but when you look at the so-called the Karens and the Beckys, you know, all of those events where in this case, particular white women are questioning the presence of a Black person in a university, bird watching, we know those stories, and God knows how much that happens. I think they keep individualizing those actions versus looking at it as a white disorder. I don't know what you think about that, if it's one way of looking at it.
It certainly is. I mean, there are many ways that whiteness, and I will call it whiteness because there are plenty of Black people who continue to promote and perpetuate this nonsense as well, that it defends itself against destruction. It defends itself against dissolution. Because at the end of the day, you know, it was said, I'm have to try to find this quote because it's a profound quote. But essentially what it says is that whiteness needs to protect itself from dissolution by continually to promote the least of it, the sort of most vulnerable in its groups, to continue to surge around the idea of whiteness, because otherwise it would be destroyed. I think Karen's, Becky's are just one way in which the identified patient or the evidence of dysfunction in whiteness continues to sort of perk through to suggest that this dysfunction is real.
Okay, great. Are you ready? Do you have anything more you want to discuss, or do you want to move into our more recent example around COVID? I just one comment. I'd love to read James Baldwin's quote, and you guys everyone has heard it before, but I'd love to read it again. If I'm not the nigger here, and if you invented him, you, the white people, invented him, then you have to find out why. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you read that again?
If I'm not the nigger here, and if you invented him, you, the white people, invented him, then you have to find out why. It's not on Black people to figure out what is going on in the dysfunction and psyche of white folk, that they need to figure out and recognize that there is a dysfunction afoot and dismantle it and address it. Correct.
Very, very strong point. Frank, can we go to the next slide? We're moving now into the COVID era, and I'm going to let Dr. Bhembe again deal with this as well.
So I want to frame this next point, sort of point on our timeline a bit with some credibility, because I think what has happened is during the era of COVID, there's been a lot of discussion about Black people and their vulnerability around the death. We call it morbidity and mortality in medicine, but the death and the consequences of illness related to COVID, that they're much more vulnerable, they're much more inclined to sort of poor outcomes. And sure, all of that is true. But what also then began to happen is that began to overlap onto their psychiatric disposition. So they were likely much more anxious, they're likely much more depressed, they're likely much more fragile and potentially going to succumb to the pressures and the stresses of this overwhelming pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, the Bill Gates Foundation and the University of Southern California, along with the NFS Foundation, were doing were studying individuals. They were studying 9,000 individuals over the course of every 2 weeks, sending them out surveys to complete. Some of most of the surveys covered everything. It covered everything, including work, health, relationships, education. It covered everything. So that study started in 2014. So well before the pandemic, and continued through the pandemic, and it's continuing to this day. What we found during taking a sample of some of the data that they were able to collect during the pandemic was that the suspicions that we had, or that the narrative that was now being sort of propelled about Black people's vulnerability was true regarding their physical health, but was not true regarding their mental health, their psychological and psychiatric health. That in fact, Black people were having lower levels of depression and anxiety compared to white people. And when you look at the data, and we'll see a slide with the data on it. When you look at the data prior to the pandemic, the rates of depression and anxiety for Black people was definitely higher than that for whites. But when you look at from March 2020 to March 2021, April 2021, the evidence is clear that the depression and anxiety the degrees of depression and anxiety in the Black community was much lower during the pandemic. So the public health crisis, like the COVID-19 pandemic, hit populations really hard and was certainly worsened mental health. But in the Black community, uniquely so, they did not have the worsening in their outcomes. They actually had the reverse, and it's been well documented. So Black Americans maintain significantly better mental health outcomes than non-Black Americans, despite their struggle against economic, health, racial inequalities during the pandemic. And the next slide is actually just a graphic to sort of show you the data points that were collected during this period. So the top half of the graph is the white outcome, the white data that was collected. The bottom half of the graph is the Black data that was collected. And the top blue line is the degree of psychological distress, mild to severe psychological distress. And as you can see, that blue top line in the white section is markedly higher or markedly distant from the Black and green line. The Black and green line are the positive anxiety and depressive symptoms during the period. But looking at the bottom graph, where you're looking at the blue line for the Black individuals, you can distinctly see that there is a smaller gap between the severity of psychological distress that they were experiencing and what their study has been able to show is that the degree of anxiety and depression is markedly different, markedly lower for Black individuals than it was for white individuals. I have a theory about that, Jordana.
Yes, well, I was going to say, and someone mentioned in the chat, the quote is high melanin levels tend to be resilient. Oppression trains that. Somebody has placed that. So I was going to say, ask if you could discuss the why behind this in your theories and your knowledge of that.
You know, that's a great theory that melanin somehow protects you. I think there's also another theory that if we can get ourselves away from the dysfunction of whiteness, Blackness will be better off. And I think what the pandemic, and certainly March 2020 through April 2021, was a clear period of quarantining.
Separated, yeah.
Yes, there was separation. So you had the protection of your home, you had the protection of distance. There was financial supports because there were stimulus checks coming in. There was the idea that outside of this dysfunction, this swell milieu of white dysfunction, Blackness can do okay. We can actually make gains that we don't otherwise make when we're embedded in this racist structure, in this oppressive structure that exists now.
And Dr. Bhembe, so I've read, and I don't know if it was Carol Anderson or someone, when you go back to the days of segregation, when you looked at Black communities that were in their bubble with Black teachers, Black lawyers, Black retailers, that there was a level of health there because they were separated from white society and the violence of white society. And I was wondering if the COVID in some way recreated that feeling of safety, despite all of the huge difficulties imposed by COVID.
Yes, yes, most definitely. I mean, we know that from Black Wall Street, right? Black Wall Street came right after Plessy versus Ferguson, where it was sort of separate but equal. But yet the Black Wall Street thrived. Black businesses thrived, Black hotels thrive, insurance companies, banks, grocers, skillsmen thrive because the community came together, and in the community there was support and affirmation and reassurance and capacity potentially to thrive out of that. Even today, when you talk to college students and you talk to college students who come out of a black sort of comforting, supportive, nurturing environment into even Ivy League schools with all their academic capacities, and they embed themselves into a white institution or white structural cultural structure, they struggle. And they struggle because they don't have the affirmation, they don't have the reassurance, their community is distant from them. It has a psychological toll on them.
And they're actively dealing with white racism, white and like active microaggressions and so forth. So yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting also when, I don't know if you're done with this slide, Dr. Bhembe?
Oh, I am, yes.
Okay, next slide, please. What I wanted to bring up here, and of course, Dr. Bhembe, I think this is important and this is very new, and it reminds me of the so-called white rage and pushback that we see here, that when whites became aware that COVID was affecting Black people and people of color more, they suddenly were less concerned about it and about particularly protecting other people, particularly people they really don't care about. And you look here in the second bullet, there's a long history of social psychology research showing white Americans tend to be less concerned about problems that mostly affect, in this case, they use the term non-white people. And so this study, and you'll see it, well, we used not a medical source, but NPR, just from April 4th, 2022. I was wondering if you had any comments about this, and if you see it again as a pushback in a modern context, this white rage pushback.
So, the Race Recovery Project is really a project that is focused on the health and well-being of Blackness in the context of white dysfunction. But what it requires us to understand white dysfunction in order to be able to combat and navigate it successfully. If whiteness is anything, it's unconscious. What it does is it actually wreaks havoc in the sort of unseen, unknown. And so when you start seeing individuals who determine that the pandemic now somehow creates an opportunity for them to then start to feel as if they need to protect themselves, or that the racial disparities make them less fearful of COVID, so that they're now taking less precautions. Those are defense mechanisms that are actually coming out of an unconscious dysfunction. And these dysfunctions work themselves in the bodies and through the bodies and in their actions and their non-actions. And then it seeps into the world and it explodes. And what happens to whiteness is that when they see your response, the response of those of us who are aware, who are conscious, who can see it, who are discerning, when they see the reflection of themselves, the reaction to their explosion, they then retreat. They start to defend themselves. And that's what you're seeing in this slide here. The explanation about what's happening here is a psychological process that is occurring in whiteness in response to its dysfunction being exposed.
Okay. Someone made a point in the chat about when Black people are left alone, and I'm presuming that means apart from white society, there's a thriving, and it reminds me of in 2020, Reverend Al Sharpton, around the death of George Floyd, at his memorial, he said to white society, take your knee off our neck. he said that, and that reminds me of that. It's like, get away from us, deal with your illness,
Yes.
and let us thrive. And I think that's,
Yes.
very
It
powerful.
says a lot about, and certainly, this is not relegated to race. This is humankind, human nature. It says a lot about you when you allow truth to be deferred for self-promotion.
Yes.
So when you got a body of people who will walk through life in denial and deluded or blinded by their own self-promotion, the only reason that we don't have action yet to move the needle forward on that is because there's a powerful arm that holds the sway relative to white culture in this country. But the evidence is clear, the psychological impact is clear, the imprint in Black lives and its damage to Black lives is clear. So this is not something that we can sit on and continue to sort of deny it ourselves about or be in denial about, because then it says more about us. And I love the saying that says, we shudder at the thought of repeating the initial sins of our nation. We hear that. We don't want to repeat the sins of our nation. Yet, what is the sin of our nation? What is the real sin of our nation? The real sin of our nation is to walk around in delusion, to walk around as if we don't see truth, and that we can substitute truth for self-promotion.
Yeah. Yes. All right. Sorry,
yeah.
Go ahead.
No. I just wanted to make sure that we had opportunity to talk about all of this, because this is it's a platform, I think, that is hard to get your head around. It's hard to really conceive of, because psychiatry and psychology have lived in the internal world. They've sort of lived in the sort of unseen place where it's potentially we're not familiar, we're not comfortable, we don't have much experience with, as a lay community, as a culture, looking at and embracing the ideas of the impact of the destruction of whiteness and white supremacist structures on the nation, on the bodies, on the people of this country. Yet, right. If you look at the psychological aspect of this and you look at it from that framework, there is no denying that not only has there been an impact and has there been an assault, there continues to be assaults, there continues to be an impact, and the damage needs repairing. The POWs in North Korea got deprogramming. They got therapy. The ones who were able to come out and survive got deprogramming and were able potentially to separate themselves from this, the Stockholm syndrome thing that they got. Where is that for Black people? Where has that been for Black individuals about how we elevate the concerns of living in a sort of captive environment where you a prisoner of war, I said reparations, that's not my place, but no repair, no treatment, no interventions for that.
Right. Dr. Bhembe, are you aware of any researchers or psychiatrists who have shifted the lens to white psychosis and diagnoses of white delusion and things related to whiteness?
Yeah, there are a couple. There's Donna Minkowitz.
How do you spell that?
Yeah,
do you know?
Donna is D-O-N-N-A, and
yeah.
Minkowitz is Minkowitz.
Okay.
And then the other is Natasha Stovall.
How do you spell hers if you have it?
Yep, Natasha, that's Natasha, and Stovall is Stovall.
B as in boy? I didn't hear that.
B as in Victor.
Stovall. Okay, great.
B as in Victor.
V, okay, perfect.
That is, you have to sort of hats off to those individuals who are sort of forging through the thick of this to declare clarity, to make us take a stand and be clear and truthful about what is seeing and what we have to see. They will reference, and I'm sure you'll come across our listeners when they start to sort of dive into this, there was a Norwich physician back in the 1600s who also started to talk about this, about the religion of a doctor and the falsities that we buy into as a culture of whiteness. He even said, and I'm going to actually have him quoted here, that America is the metaphor for domains of uncharted ignorance.
Oh, yes.
So Sir Thomas Browne was his name, a Norwich physician who wrote about this in the 1600s. I think the problem is that when we start to tread into this territory, if we leave it we don't potentially connect it to a movement, we don't connect it to an ongoing campaign. It, like the information about how they built the pyramids, or the information about the early mathematics abilities of the early, will be lost, that we will have to recreate and revisit all of this again. And it'll be as if it never happened, just like Norwich physician, Dr. Sir Thomas Browne, having spoken about this, or Frank Fanon, for that matter, another Black psychiatrist, speaking about this decades ago, but us still not having traction.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I think we're going to move on, but first I want to thank you, Dr. Bhembe. You probably haven't had a chance to read the chat, but you're going to see that a lot of information is new and frightening to people, and